Hello. The purpose of this short video is to provide some directions around the assignment 1. It's my experience that students who do well in this particular assignment are those who come up with a clear clinical audit topic, such as: do colleagues comply with best practice when blah blah blah. So it's quite an explicit statement and it's focused on clinical practice. So do colleagues comply with best practice during XX and X. The second point is a background statement. Students who tend to get this wrong are those who provide a general discussion around their topic of clinical practice. That's not what we want. The background statement, and for students who do this section well, are those who are able to say why this topic, why at this time, and why it's relevant to their clinical setting or their particular clinical practice. So it's really contextualizing that topic in place, in time, in practice. The next part is the PICO format. This tends to be poorly completed. The biggest tip I can give you here is to have a look at the resources in this particular subject, look at them in the text, and even look at some searching for yourselves around different applications of the PICO format. But do remember that in the PICO format, the comparison, is not always applied. So for some students there will be a patient, there will be an intervention, and there will be an outcome, but there may not always be a comparison. The PICO format tends to be poorly done, and the idea of it is really to help you focus on identifying not only your topic but also the key search terms that will help inform your search strategy, which is the next part. Most students do the search well. And why do they do the search well? It is because they make quite clear the different databases and the search strategies that they have used. And the students who do this section particularly well, and also therefore grab the evidence that they need to support them, or give themselves the best opportunity to grab that evidence, are those students who present their work in two tables. And the first table is a description of the search strategy with all the parameters that surround that. So that's a really good tip, to include a table that defines the search parameters, and in the subject there are some examples of that. So please use them, they work. And the second table that is really good is, once you've done that search, is an evidence table. So an evidence of the findings, what literature or what evidence that you have found, and that goes right across the continuum from Cochrane systematic reviews right through to non-gradable items such as hospital guidelines or recommendations from authorities, etc. So there's a range of literature, and people who do this well are those who present that in a table and make it quite clear. The next part in this search strategy, when you're talking about your evidence and what you're finding, is a statement around how you manage that evidence. Students who do this well are those who include an inclusion or an exclusion criteria. So it may be that you have found 40 or 50 or 60 items of evidence, but not all those items of evidence will be useful or relevant exactly to your topic. So you need a simple statement that talks about how you've taken the evidence that you've found from your 50 or 60 or 100 items down to what is usable and applicable for your subject. and that's a simple statement of inclusion and exclusion. The rationale for why you have chopped or removed things, and the rationale for why you've included what you've included. The next part is the literature review, or the critical review of the evidence. It would have to be the most important part from the point of view, if you get it wrong, your approach to it wrong, it impacts greatly on what you're able to produce at the end. What do I mean by this? I mean simply that do not write this as an essay. That's the first and most important point, and it is the most common problem that for students who fail this particular activity. They make that mistake. They write it as an assignment, as an essay, as a discussion around and of the topic, as opposed to examining each item of literature that they have found and talking about that in terms of what is making assessments, and talking about in terms of what is good, what is bad, and what is indifferent, and putting all the elements of that together to come up with a clinical bottom line. And your clinical bottom line really is a summary of what you've reviewed in critical terms in the body of the body of your essay, so to speak. So, biggest tip is do not write it as an assignment. Do not write it as a discussion around your topic. You must examine the evidence, the items of evidence, and put those together in a way that demonstrates critical review, what's strong, what's weak, etc., and come up with a view around these particular items. Not talking about, not as a scholarly piece, citing different authors' views and thoughts. Don't do that, people, please. Importantly, then you come up with this clinical bottom line, which I touched on, is a summary of your critical review. Okay. What's important about that? Well, the clinical bottom line pulls together your ideas, and it also makes quite clear to the reader the levels of evidence of the items of evidence that you're citing supporting your clinical bottom line. So you might have a clinical bottom line that states X, X and X, and then you'll have all the evidence, the supporting that particular item, rated at levels 1 through to 4 to ungradable, etc. And that's very clear to the reader what the evidence, the quality of that evidence is, the rating of that evidence is in terms of hierarchy of evidence for that statement that you've developed. So it's bringing all those points together. From that leads on to your statement of what is best practice. Your statements of what is best practice must give the clinician direction. It must tell the clinician exactly what is to be done. The most common problem here is when people write their best practice statements, they are either global and non-directive, or they're so specific that they don't give a clear application for different people applying those best practice standards to their practice. So you can go too micro, if I can put it that way, or you can go too broad. Your statements must give the clinician clear direction as to you need to do this, and if you do this, that's what best practice is. And at the end of each of those best practice statements, you'll have a grade of recommendation, either A or B. Now, in terms of the grade of recommendation, that's important because that gives the clinician reading that best practice statement an idea of the reliability that the best practice statement will have when applied to clinical practice. So if it is an A, you can be more confident that if you implement this standard of best practice, it will have the effect that you so desire. If it's a B, it's telling the clinician if you do this, It may have the effect, but it may not. So buyer beware, so to speak. So the best practice statement pulls these items together and helps you rate, pulls all your clinical bottom line ideas together, and then it helps you rate the quality of that evidence. So behind a best practice statement, what might you have? Well, you might in fact have a best practice statement that is based on a systematic review, a Cochrane review, etc., a randomized controlled trial, something like that. Now, if that's the quality of evidence supporting that, it'll be a grade A recommendation. And that tells the clinician that there is strong evidence on this particular item that if you do this, it will have the effect so desired. Whereas, if it is a recommendation that is based on a series of evidence that is perhaps expert opinion, perhaps small studies, and limited studies, but that's all there is available, and it's a grade B recommendation, that says to the clinician, at the moment, this is best practice. It may not be based on the strongest of evidence, but it's what we've got currently. So please, use this, but use it with caution. It may have these effects, but maybe not in every case. We need more evidence on this, but it is the best. Okay, so that's where you end up. You start with a topic and you work your way methodically through this process to end up with those best practice statements that tell a clinician, if you do these things, this is current best practice evidence, and it hopefully will improve practice. But it's important that you arrive at those best practice statements because then after that you will then plan the performance, or the implementation I should say, of the clinical audit based on those best practice recommendations. So the students who do well do all of those things. The students who don't do so well make some fundamental errors throughout those processes that I've outlined. And the biggest problem is when you do a critique of the literature, don't write it as an essay. Don't write it as a scholarly discussion of topic. It is an examination of the items of evidence you have found to arrive at that clinical bottom line. Thank you. I hope you found this informative. Bye.